Our guest this morning is Brennan Kettelle. Brennan is a PhD researcher at the Center for History of Hermetic Philosophy and Related Currents in Amsterdam. Brennan's other academic interests include 19th and 20th century occultism, sex magic, esotericism and politics, and conspirituality. Brennan's PhD project investigates historical associations between the religio-mythic demoness Lilith and queerness within 19th century literary, artistic, and occult discourse. Her research also focuses on the lesbian, pagan, fin de siècle poetess Renee Vivien, analyzing the occult influences of her queer satanic oeuvre. This morning, we'll be discussing Brennan's research, as well as her upcoming course on Lilith. I'd like to first introduce my co-host, who is the curator of the weird and occult at the fabulous podcast Rejected Religion, Stephanie Shea. Welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Jason. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
I am very excited for today's guest. This is somebody that you have had many wonderful conversations with. So, Brennan, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be on.
Christening her with the title The Monstrous Queer, you utilize several hermeneutical crosscurrents, including monster and queer theory, to analyze receptions of Lilith. So tell us a little bit about your methodology in approaching the study of receptions of Lilith.
In my ongoing dissertation, I do focus on Lilith within the 19th century. So I am, a historian of modernity. I have picked a demonic research muse who has been around for, over 5,000 years and haunted humanity, since Antiquity. So I am, of course, familiar with her more ancient and medieval iterations and narratives, etc. But I do specialize in Lilith within the 19th and 20th and 21st centuries. In terms of methodology, so of course, my dissertation itself is being done at the Center for the History of Hermetic Philosophy and Related Currents. It's a mouthful. That's why we call it HHP. So, of course, because my research on Lilith has kind of an esoteric theme or is under the umbrella of esotericism studies, I take, an overall historical approach to trace esoteric ideas, philosophies, cultural receptions, their transformations, and then how Lilith works within that, which means a lot of archival research, cultural history. However, my theoretical analyses do indeed come from monster theory and queer theory in analyzing Lilith's not only cultural receptions, but what I think is more importantly is her cultural utilizations, whether that's weaponization, reclamation within kind of the 19th century. And since I would consider the current dissertation project that I'm working on to be a queer historical project as well. Of course, I pull in queer theory or queer historical studies, but I would like to address that if I say I'm quote unquote queering Lilith or something, it's not me arguing that Lilith is like a bisexual Scorpio or anything like that. No kind of queer projection upon Lilith herself, but moreover, I'm trying to examine the binaries in terms of sexuality and gender that Lilith is placed in discursively, but then zoom out and see what discourses or historical utilizations or receptions of Lilith occur outside of such a fixed position and kind of take other perspectives. And especially with queer theory, if we're using queer theory, this is such a generalization, I suppose, or a simplification, but using queer theory to explore or critique or deconstruct formulations of different identity categories that relate to sexuality and gender. And then also, furthermore, be concerned about how discourses or representations or politics are produced by these kind of cultural understandings of sexuality and gender. Of course, she was used as this representation as kind of this deviant, perverse female sexuality. When I'm investigating Lilith in the 19th century, what I argue is there are also a lot of discursive and semiotic associations between Lilith and lesbianism, just perverse feminine sexuality in general, but also sapphic sexuality. So when I'm looking at Lilith's representation in art and literature and then looking for these associations, that's also where monster theory comes back in. So queer theory and monster theory and queer historical studies all hold hands in my work because I think there's an intuitive connection there. I have termed Lilith as the monstrous queer. And this is a direct kind of piggybacking out of, academic admiration and love of Barbara Creed's concept of the monstrous feminine. But I call Lilith kind of the monstrous queer in this attempt to blend Barbara Creed's theoretical works on the monstrous feminine, but also Harry M. Benshoff's book, Monsters in the Closet, Homosexuality in the Horror Film, which was kind of this very early kind of monster studies and monster theory book. I think it was 1996, 1997 it was published, because I'm using kind of monstrous queer to maybe try to combine the monstrous feminine and the monster and the homosexual in a broader umbrella of overall 19th century conceptions of deviance. So essentially my methodology is esotericism and monsters and queer historical studies dancing together with Lilith.
So monster theory is central to your methodology. And of course, monster theory is a concept that has been around for quite a while, first coming up, of course, in Jeffrey Jerome Cohen's 7 Theses of Monster Theory, this monster theory reader. So why are the categories laid out by monster theory helpful in analyzing Lilith?
I think, of course, the foundational text of monster theory is Jeffrey Jerome Cohen's 7 Theses. I will be kind of cherry picking of these 7 theses in our discussion, just because I feel like it's so foundational, not only to monster theory as a field, but also to my guideline and my framework for how I analyze Lilith. I think that Cohen's first theses, which is essentially, I hope I'm not paraphrasing, the monster's body is a cultural body, which in other words basically just suggests that we can learn a lot about a society, religion, movement, political party, individual by the monsters that they fear and employ. So if I'm looking at Lilith, let's say in the 19th century, when this is a time where there are really panicky and restrictive discourses and kind of oppressive expectations regarding gender roles, sexuality, queerness is being written about, studied, pathologized increasingly. If we kind of put Lilith against this backdrop, and I essentially argue not only is Lilith representing this deviant, uncontrolled feminine sexuality within the 19th century, but also a lesbian sexuality, then that says about the 19th century that they are increasingly anxious and fearful of, uncontrolled, unregulated feminine sexuality, queerness, kinds of gender embodiments or sexualities that don't fall within that heteropatriarchal 19th century Victorian paradigm. And Lilith then becomes, in the 19th century, this kind of demonic lesbian threat. Whereas, let's say in the 20th century, as Lilith is embraced by the, second wave feminist movement, primarily fighting for, among many things, abortion access, birth control access, safer sex education, etc. Lilith kind of becomes this patriarchy smashing icon of feminism against the 20th century backdrop. So it kind of can change depending on the era, the geography, the culture, the politics of any given time. But I think that Cohen's framing within this first thesis of the monster as basically being constructed and utilized as this embodied projection of a society's shames and sins and fears, and then kind of just becoming this waste bin receptacle of, insecurities, prejudice, taboo. I think that is maybe, for me in my research, one of the most foundational points of not only monster theory, but maybe even like the axis upon which my analyses on Lilith spins, right? But secondly, I think it's important to know, and this is another foundational component or pillar of my research on Lilith in particular, is that, of course, not only do monsters betray fears and prejudices and beliefs and rules and expectations that specific groups or cultures have, but monsters also serve the function out of the fear that they induce within the cultural imagination, the collective, to kind of reify and police cultural boundaries and margins. So especially if we zoom out and we kind of look at who decides what the monster is in the first place, and then look at the function of that fear of the monster. The monster, I think Jeffrey Jerome Cohen even uses the word border patrol agent. Like the monster becomes a border patrol agent of sorts for these hegemonic branches and institutions of a culture. And since the monster itself is this embodied representation of that terrifying difference that exists not only outside of, but also beyond a given cultural system, the monster simultaneously warns you to remain within the boundaries. So if you don't want the monster under the bed to get you, make sure you sleep with your hands and feet within the confines of the four corners of your bed. And yeah, that to me is what the monster does culturally as well. So we can kind of, if we're looking at monsters like Lilith that, let's say, represent some kind of deviancy, what the fear of, let's say, Lilith in the 19th century is saying is you have to remain within the safety and the confines of society, within law and order, within the established gender roles, gender presentation, kind of Victorian breeder-based sexual practices. Because look at all these monsters such as Lilith that represent some kind of deviancy. And if you align with this deviancy, instead of exercising it from your person or from your family, from your social group, you go further and further into the margins and the monster will get you. This is like the precipice where I jump off for the monster. The monster can serve also the function, depending on who's using the monster or aligning with the monster, of breaking boundaries as well, not just policing culturally, which Cohen, one of his last theses is the monster
Stands at the
Monster
threshold
stands
of
at the
becoming.
That's
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
I think this is what my Lilith research also is like really founded on, like that tension between the monster as a border patrol agent, as Cohen says, or the monster as a horizon of liberation.
I wanted to also refer to the 7 Theses. And in particular, I was looking at other archetypes in Antiquity. If we're talking about the monstrous feminine, for example, the figure of Lamia would be one. And I was looking at the similarities between these two women. And very striking similarities because both are depicted as supernatural female figures associated with death of children and seduction. And for listeners out there that might not be familiar with the Lamia myth in Greek mythology, she was originally the queen of Libya who had an affair with Zeus. And then Hera found out about this, and she either, depending on the story, killed Lamia's children or forced Lamia to kill her own children. And so whoever was doing the killing of the children drove Lamia into madness. And then she transformed into this serpent hybrid, human woman serpent figure who preyed on children. And Lilith in Jewish folklore also had these types of connotations, that she was also preying on children. And then later, both figures, their representation kind of changed into this seductress type of character. So they were linked to seductive spirits who drank blood. And then we get into the whole vampire thing that you and I had talked about before on my podcast. But both figures are reflecting these fears surrounding loss, especially maternal loss, female autonomy, and the dangers of the supernatural. So looking at thesis number 1, the monster's body is the cultural body. In this case, both Lilith and Lamia embody these societal fears surrounding female autonomy, like I said, maternal loss, sexuality, and these monstrous forms reflect the anxieties that people have about women who defy traditional roles. I just think the monster theory theses, I think that are very interesting in how you can compare, contrast, but also see this interconnectedness in a lot of different things that you're doing. And that's why I find your work to be really interesting, because you are highlighting all of these links and you're, showcasing these types of things. So we can see how these concepts and these ideas are very much playing out as far as boundaries are concerned, as what you were talking about before, because you're transgressing these boundaries and you're going outside of what it is that you're expected to do. And in this case, just as a woman or as a female agency in that regard.
I would just respond to one of your points, which I think it kind of bleeds into why do monsters scare us? And I think it's the transgression theme that you brought up. Monsters embody transgression, transcendence, or just utter disregard for boundaries. So their physical appearance is, as you also noted with the Lamia, their physical appearance can consist of a hybridity between human and animal body parts. They can be dangerously deceiving, like the seductive sirens, or grotesque, like the wooded witch with mossy hair and black fingernails. They have, abilities that we as humans can't control or mimic. or even understand or predict, such as, demons being these tempters from God's grace, witches manipulating nature, time, monsters engage in culturally unacceptable behaviors, such as drinking blood, as you say. And they're full of contradictions, like ghosts are there, but not. You can't hit one, but it's there. Or vampires as the living dead. So I think that the theme of transgression is also kind of a super foundational talking point when we're talking about monsters, especially in terms of why they scare us as humans.
Right, right. This similarities between these two female characters also fit with several other of the theses.
If you look at Greek and Roman mythological lore, there's a disproportionate amount of women on women violence for something that is perpetuated by a male. And usually it's Zeus, who is, let's just say,
Usually.
raping these women. We're not going to sugarcoat it, being tricky or anything, although that's what the ancient language implies. And again, this reflects the cultural conceptions of the time. The origin story of the Lamia is really interesting in the sense of you see that it is Hera reacting to something, right? You look at any kind of monster who's represented in the monstrous feminine way, turned into something else because she affected the honor of a goddess. Io is another example, turned into the white heifer by Hera because of something that, surprise, surprise, Zeus did. So it's very strange just in terms of the cultural context as well. The disproportionate amount of women on women violence in these stories is very, and let's just say it, sexual assault by males in these stories is really concerning and troubling, and something that whenever we talk about these stories on my show, I bring up and point out the problematic nature of it.
But I think this also ties into this whole idea of the monster in and of itself, because the monster is a reaction to that injustice, that crime that was committed. And then in this context, Zeus always seems to get away with everything. He can just do whatever he wants. And Hera, instead of getting mad at him, takes out her anger and revenge on the female character, the woman, or whatever, identifying female characters in all of these various tales where things like this happen. I find that to be fascinating. But that the monster then is this reactionary character that is like actually holding up the mirror saying, this is actually really crappy. And this monster is actually the reflection of all of this violence and injustice that is actually happening.
Actually, that is such an important read. And what's so interesting is, as you're saying this, Jason brought up the theme of woman-on-woman violence in a lot of these Greek myths. And also, Stephanie, in tandem with the woman-on-woman violence, you're also noting how, let's say, Zeus, for instance, usually gets away with these things. And to bring it back to Lilith, because Lamia is, I would absolutely argue, an iteration of Lilith within the Greek context, also alongside the Roman Strix, which was similar to the Greek Lamia in certain ways, and both have this violence against men / anti-maternal, also mildly seductive in different ways, themes like Lilith. But if we go further back in Antiquity and then also bring in Lilithian representations there in terms of gender, I'm thinking of two instances which almost contradict or maybe just circumvent how, let's say, the Greek Lamia narrative is portrayed. One Lilithian instance I'm thinking of is Lilith's kind of initial iteration as not a singular female demonic entity, but as a legion of wind spirits, actually both female and male. Within Antiquity, there was this fear that human men or women could kind of become victim to the succubus or incubus, female or male knights, sex demons, let's just say. And so if there was, a member of your family or community who may have been afflicted by having a male or female Lilith attached to them, there was an exorcism kind of script that was actually more of like a divorce proceeding. It's called a get. And typically this was to exorcise a female Lilith from a husband, because I think perhaps the symptoms of having a succubus attached to you maybe were more apparent through nocturnal emissions, for instance. But essentially, it would be an exorcism script that was a divorce proceeding, kind of divorcing the Lilith demon from this spiritual astral marriage and sending the Lilith demon away. So in that way, it was kind of like a subversion of the power, where it wasn't, the female human Lamia getting turned into the monster Lamia because of Hera's rage. It was actually, a family or a community being afraid that one of the paternal figures had a female demon attached to him and they had to do a divorce exorcism ritual. Also, the Lamashtu of the mid to late Babylonian period is actually the first time that Lilith was represented as a singular entity before the Alphabet of Ben Sira, of course. But the Lamashtu was this kind of demon queen. And this is, I think, the only Lilith iteration, like in her narrativist history, that doesn't have the sexual component. It was bloodlust. She would eat men's bones, drink their blood, strangle pregnant women, murder children, bring disease, pestilence, fail crops, kill animals, etc. And she was so feared that the lay folk would actually do summonings of Pazuzu, a king demon of the wind, and actually the demon who possessed Regan in The Exorcist. They would summon Pazuzu to get rid of Lamashtu because Pazuzu and Lamashtu were mortal demonic enemies, allegedly. So there was such a fear of this kind of oppressive feminine in certain Lilith discourses. But then when we get to the Lamia, it was the human Lamia being monsterized through this kind of like oppression and rage and vengeance, which is interesting. And I'm a modernist, so I don't know what to do with this.
Let's get into Lilith's origins in ancient Near Eastern lore. You mentioned Lamashtu, the influence of ancient Near Eastern lore, its influence on Greece. There's no doubt about it with scholars. Everything from Hesiod on down through Homer is influenced somehow by ancient Near Eastern myth.
How to encapsulate a wind spirit haunting alongside humanity for 5 millennia. I'll try to be somewhat brief, but essentially, Lilith, at least her etymological root, scholars of antiquity argue can be found in the Sumerian Lil, L-I-L, which is the Sumerian word for breath, but then also kind of dust cloud. But then that can also lead to ghost. I read an explanation of one scholar explaining that this dust storm to ghost pipeline could have been, when there are actual dust storms, it's kind of an embodied shape or being. So the Lil was, again, a spirit of the wind that eventually, like through the kind of adjacent Mesopotamian communities, like the Akkadians, Assyrians, Babylonians, Sumerians, kind of evolved to then have associations with ghosts, associations with wind, associations with nighttime. So that having this proto-demonization occur to the point where the Lil was again seen as legion or a category of spirit, but then with either the Akkadians or the Assyrians split this Lil into 4 kind of different categories: the Lili, Lili-Tu, Ardot Lili, and Irdot Lili spirits. Specifically, the Ardot Lili and the Irdu Lili were the kind of succubus and incubus spirits of this legion of wind demons. But what's important to note is that even this kind of early on, eventually there were these associations between Lilith and sexuality, or kind of dangerous nocturnal nighttime sexuality through the succubus and incubus. And also, if we look within antiquity and, for instance, the incantation bowls that Lilith is found in, a lot of those incantation bowls, the texts and the scripts within them aren't just to kind of rid or banish or trap a Lilith demon, but also discuss, for instance, the ways in which Lilith demons are dangerous to girls and women in different developmental stages of their life. As a child, then a girl who has her period and begins menstruating, the childbirth/motherhood era up until menopause. So there's all these different ways that these Lili-Tu demons or spirits would have been dangerous to women at different times in their lives. Also, a lot of the texts surrounding Lilith in, for instance, these Aramaic incantation bowls discuss how she is dangerous to boys and girls and children. Again, I mentioned already the divorce gets, the exorcism scripts that remove Lilith from this sexual spiritual marriage with a human man or woman. So we see very early on, even though there's a lot of different forms, shapes, names, iterations of Lilith, the themes of the anti-maternal, the themes of dangerous sexuality, and kind of endangering men and women in different ways, but being this kind of bedeviling figure nonetheless. I think that if we also apply all of these themes and the slightly different ways that Lilith's haunted in antiquity, for instance, we can already see, certain things such as, she's a monster from beyond this world, whether she was coded as being from the infernal realms or whether she was just coded as being an uncontrollable wind spirit. This succubus figure, her appearance, especially in the incantation bowls, kind of, combines these animalistic and human features. We see a power to possess, the power to fly, all of this early on, which is, like we were just discussing, these terrifying, monstrous transgressions of boundaries that, as the millennia go on, it makes sense as her lore is built upon over and over, she continues to scare because she always continues to transgress. And as Cohen says, the monster always escapes. I mean, you can phrase that as the monster never dies, because Lamia may not have been called Lilith. And the Lilith that we know is, in my opinion, not birthed until somewhere between the 8th and 10th centuries Common Era with the Alphabet of Ben Sira. But there were all these other Liliths. And so the Lilith that we have kind of brought into our current centuries, the singular figure who was Adam's first wife before Eve, is actually already built upon the shoulders of other Lilith spirits and demons that have not died over the millennia.
Actually, I wanted to stay on a couple of sections here with the monstrous feminine. I think just getting back to the concept of the ancient demoness, the Lamia, being danger to men, that speaks to Julia Kristeva's concept of objection. I really think that there's a kind of, and this isn't the monster thesis too, right? With fear of the monster, I think it's really a kind of desire. And it's really interesting, you were just talking about these demons as a night spirit. There's actually supernatural revenant, so it's kind of Lilith adjacent, kind of ghost adjacent. It's the story found in this guy who wrote in the 2nd century named Phlegon O'Trolleys. He's got a story. It's about this young girl named Philinian who dies, and then she visits the person who's renting a room in her parents' house every night, and she has sex with them. It's a really interesting ghost story. It's a much older story, but it was written down in the 2nd century. It was the influence for the Bride of Corinth. That's really interesting because in Greek antiquity, the woman, surprise, surprise, was considered the more lustful person, which is very strange, right? But this was the inversion of the value.
Yeah, exactly.
But actually, there were more monstrous feminine figures besides Lamia. And you brought up the Strix and the Roman tradition, but also there was the Empusa. And this is just like another kind of interchangeable term for Lamia, like a female vampire figure. There's a great story by a writer named Philostratus, again in the 2nd century, who writes about this ancient pagan holy man figure named Apollonius of Tyana. And he had a pupil who fell in love with this woman, and she turned out to be an Empusa. It's a great story. The pupil's like so excited. He's like, "You got to come, visit my house." And Apollonius goes in there and he's like, "None of this is real. She's creating an illusion," and she turns out to be an Empusa. So, really interesting story. The Lilith we know is an amalgam of these earlier archetypes molded in Jewish legend, not only in Midrash and these later legends, but also the apotropaic technologies such as incantation bowls, protective charms. So tell us more about this.
Well, I think it's interesting if we're talking again about the incantation bowls, protective charms, exorcism scripts, etc. We were just talking about Lilith and some ways that these Lilith spirits would have subverted or kind of flipped gender roles in antiquity. I think another kind of interesting side angle, also if we're considering charms and bowls, etc., is, for instance, Lilith, let's say, kind of transcending beyond class distinctions or boundaries that would have been in existence or established at the time. So, for instance, what I mean by this is in, the medieval period, more generally, there was a female night spirit called Lilith that appeared in the Talmud, a central Jewish religious text. But my point here is that the Talmud would have been compiled and read by the elite and educated, initiated, we could even say, whereas the kind of lay people were engaging in these bowls or charms or artifacts to ward off or trap or expel Lilith. And the fact that Lilith is mentioned within both of these, let's say, sources around similar times or within the same cultural context means that essentially the culture was so afraid of Lilith, or Lilith was so present within sociocultural discourse that it didn't matter if it was, let's say, a more elite, learned, educated person who was able to read, or a lay person arming themselves with charms and bowls. Lilith was discussed, acknowledged, and feared across these kind of class lines and boundaries, which to me says that she really penetrated Jewish demonology and culture quite early on. I argue she penetrated the mainstream in like the 19th century, but she was really a facet of a lot of different kind of cultures or religious groups much prior to the 19th century.
Definitely tying into the fourth thesis that the monster dwells at the gates of difference.
Mm-hmm.
The monster serves as the embodied other, a conglomerate representation of cultural, political, racial, economic, sexual, and bodily alterity. Differences are exaggerated into monstrous aberration. Here we go, aberration. A rhetorical strategy we are familiar with from histories of identity-based persecution. The monster combines different forms of alterity and deviance.
Yeah.
And of course, what you touched upon before about thesis number 3, the one before that, the monster is the harbinger of category crisis.
Yeah.
Blurring the boundaries, ambiguous natures, all of that stuff fits right into that.
Yes. And taking kind of both of these, I think, to jump off of that quickly, especially considering kind of boundaries and alterity, and tying it into, again, your question on the bowls and charms and such, Lilith was kind of also thought to haunt these like thresholds, like dark corners of a room or doorways were kind of places where Lilith would be lingering and hiding. You have the incantation bowl, which would be, flipped over to try to trap a Lilith. So there's this kind of very liminal in-between haunting of thresholds. An infant in a crib, for instance, there were certain texts, not even with Antiquity, I believe this would have been maybe even the Middle Ages, actually, of if a baby is laughing in the crib, you have to wake the baby because a Lilith, again, plural at this time, a Lilith would be kind of tickling him or playing with him or going to get him. So, and of course, the crib could say this liminal doorway between new life or like sudden death. Interestingly, of course, side note, I think in a time when SIDS, for instance, sudden infant death syndrome wasn't, identified as the way we would identify it now, Lilith or a Lilith demon would have been blamed for something like that, which is again quite liminal and like threshold haunting. The fine lines between sleep and awakeness, life and death, one foot in a doorway, the other foot out of Lilith's paradoxical nature, I wanted to mention. There's a really cool Dutch tarot reader / occult practitioner, Astral Lady Tarot. Her name is Anna. She has a Patreon and she talks about Lilith a lot. So I like to tune in, but she made this tarot deck that's a magical working deck. I guess you shuffle it to see what kind of spell work or ritual work or meditation you should be engaging in. So like a tarot, but a bit different. And on one of them, she actually has this card that's dedicated to Lilith where she calls Lilith the paradoxical queen. And I just love that. This like identification of Lilith as full of paradoxes, liminal threshold haunting. That's like an aspect of Lilith that I quite love because I think that it comes back in the 19th century in my work on Lilith in a different way. It's paradoxical and liminal in terms of gender and sexuality, in terms of crossing that threshold of the Victorian and 19th century expectations or constructions of gender and sexuality into a more unknown, quote unquote, queer kind of embodiment or subjectivity. I think we had a good discussion about all of the other iterations and forms that Lilith has taken before the 8th to 10th century Common Era, but just to quickly summarize the Alphabet of Ben Sira, because this was also the foundational narrative that the 19th century really played with in terms of Lilith. And this is also the 19th century, where Lilith was really injected into the mainstream, not just confined to esoteric or mystical texts, but actually in the pop occulture. Stephanie, who's the theorist who coined pop occulture?
Actually, it was, if I'm not mistaken, first used by Genesis Peorage.
Yes.
And then Christopher Partridge kind of, appropriated it and used it for the esoteric studies, scholarly research. But it's such a great term.
Such a good term.
It's The blending of occult and popular culture. So,
Yes.
perfect term.
Perfect term for Lilith and her 19th century kind of injection. The Alphabet of Ben Sira, a midrashic text, which would have been biblical commentary, written sometime between the 8th and 10th centuries, still debated and contested whether it was an authentic, midrashic text written by rabbis and commentators or a satirical text presented as a midrash, in more of a anti-Semitic spirit. Because, why it may be a satirical text is that before the story of Lilith, as Adam's first wife before Eve, but there's actually the story of a king who consults with a famous rabbi in the town, begging him to come do something for his daughter who is suffering from 1,000 farts, quote unquote. So it's an interesting compilation of commentary, the Alphabet Ben Sira. Interesting is downplaying. So essentially, it is taken so seriously in terms of the narrative of Lilith in the Alphabet Ben Sira is seen, at least to us, in our current century and the 19th and 20th as well, I would argue, as the origin story of Lilith, Lilith's first iteration. Essentially, within the Alphabet of Ben Sira, it's argued that this particular story of Lilith within this larger text was written to kind of address a biblical discrepancy, because in one of the first chapters of Genesis, I believe verse 27, it says God created human beings in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. And that is kind of the most important point where, discursively, it sounds like by chapter 1 of Genesis, the two, the them, the male and the female, are created at the same time. Now, it was not until the second chapter of Genesis that Eve's creation was described. Genesis, I believe it's chapter 2, verses 20 to 22, where, of course, Adam is put into a sleep and Eve is created from Adam's rib, creating woman from the man, not alongside the man. So essentially, the Alphabet Ben Sira tells this narrative that before Eve came Lilith, and Adam and Lilith were created at the same time. Lilith out of her own mound of dirt, just like Adam, but I believe some scholars argue that in the translation, it's suggesting that Lilith's mound of dirt was just like this defective mud. They have a altercation or disagreement in terms of sexual positioning regarding who should be on top. Adam wants Lilith to submit to him sexually, and she says, "Why should I submit to you when we were created equal?" In certain translations, she flees, like the nuance here, and in certain other translations, she rises into the air and flies away. But either way, before she does either of those things, she says the ineffable name of God, the unknowable name of God, and that's how her exit occurs. She goes then to the Red Sea, arriving there, which is, of course, a dwelling that was just swarming with demons and beasts. And when she's at the Red Sea, she engaged in consensual demonic intercourse, bearing tons and tons of broods of demonic children, because, of course, also demonic reproduction works differently than human 9-month incubation reproduction. Also, side note, it's worth noting that while the Red Sea was indeed, narrativistically associated with desolation, demons, it also, in other contexts, discursively signifies a place in which persecuted peoples flee persecution, such as Moses and his peoples fleeing Egypt, Moses parting the Red Sea, and the oppressed peoples crossing through the Red Sea. So even though the Red Sea is meant to signify within this story of Lilith this monstrous, demonic, desolate place, we can also consider the sanctuary themes of the Red Sea as well. Adam is lamenting that Lilith left. God sent 3 angels to retrieve her, Sinoi, Sansonoi, and Smangeloff. Lilith says no to them. They threaten to drown her. She lets them know that she can't be drowned. Then they threaten to kill 100 of her demonic children each day if she doesn't return. She actually consents to this, and she kind of also says, I was created by God to kill human children, but I won't kill any human child who's wearing, an amulet with your names on it. Also, fun fact, in the 15th or 16th century, so way after the Alphabet of Ben Sira, in another midrashic text, there's a line that says, when Lilith finds no human children born, and even if 100 of her children are already killed, by the angels each day, she turns on her own. So Lilith will even turn on her own children if she's bored and there's no human children to kill. So the anti-maternal discursive theme of Lilith was really also exaggerated and established within the Alphabet of Ben Sira, but then continued to be built upon. In a later edited version of this Alphabet of Ben Sira text, to then kind of address the discrepancy of, wait, why was Lilith able to say no to Adam, to three angels, and to God? There was an addition, a clause, something added within this text that essentially said Lilith let the angels know that she could not return to Adam because she already defiled the sanctity of her marriage by copulating with the great demon. And this also kind of then leads into the associations, in my opinion, of Lilith and Samael as demonic partners, even though that was already kind of existing. This played off of that and strengthened that as well. So also by the time we get to the 19th century, Lilith and Samael as being these demonic lovers is also played with. But yes, then, God creates Eve from Adam's rib so that this kind of emancipatory rebellion wouldn't occur again. And Lilith is just existing in the Red Sea, birthing demons and killing human children, and transformed into a monster, essentially, a singular former human who left the Garden of Eden, defied all patriarchal voices, and became monstrous.
There was a depiction in art, of course, this is modern times, that depicted Lilith as the seductress serpent.
Yes.
Against Eve.
Yeah.
What is the basis of that? Is that just pure imagination, fantasy on the part of the artist, or was there anything based in that?
Are you talking about Yuri Klapoff? Who was actually a Ukrainian landscape painter. Yeah, with this painting, Lilith and Eve, where it's a 20th century, late 1900s of Eve on the ground in the Garden of Eden and Lilith on top, and Lilith holding the apple, and this very homoerotic, sapphic sexual portrayal of these two women, which was common in the 20th century for artists, feminists, Jewish feminist poets to kind of tease and play with these narratives of Lilith and Eve actually having a homoerotic sapphic relationship, which was in harsh juxtaposition to the 19th century pitting of Lilith and Eve against each other, as Eve is the ideal 19th century woman, Lilith as the Lamia, the snake, the deviant, feminine sexual threat. So in terms of arguments of the historical foundations of this kind of sapphic narrative between Lilith and Eve, the article is called Michelangelo's Serpents with Two Tails by Jane Schuyler. It's a fantastic article, kind of an art history article on Lilith. So in this article, she essentially argues that in Michelangelo's Temptation and Expulsion painting, we have the serpent, the tempting serpent, wrapped around a tree, but the top half, the human half of the serpent, has these feminine breasts and long blonde hair. And in that painting, because Adam has blonde hair and Adam and Eve are kind of, warding off or cringing away from this tempting serpent, but Eve has brown hair, Adam has blonde hair, the tempting female serpent has blonde hair. Jane Schuyler argues that essentially, since Michelangelo would have had some familiarity, most likely, with Jewish mystical and esoteric texts or discourses, that having a female-coded tempting serpent with blonde hair and having Adam have blonde hair, that Michelangelo was, trying to insinuate that was Lilith, Adam's first wife, because of the similarity in hair color and how that was represented.
So, Brennan, your research heavily focuses on the early 20th century English-French poetess Renee Vivien. A poet of the symbolist school, Vivien inherited a cultural milieu steeped in romanticism, which was also heavily influenced and shaped by its conceptions of the classical world. Although distinct movements, Romanticism and the symbolist school both reacted against this materialist, rational worldview and used images and classical myths to, again, express their discontent with the cultural milieu in which they lived. Tell us about Renee Vivien and her life for a bit. She's a very fascinating figure.
Since you mentioned the school she comes from, or that her oeuvre is influenced by the symbolists, I also just want to mention, before jumping into Renee, that, the Romantic movement, the Pre-Raphaelites, the symbolists, the decadent poets, painters, playwrights, all the above were in this era held in fascination by the occult, the esoteric, the perverse, the sexually monstrous. And so therefore Lilith became this demonic, dangerously seductive, femme fatale muse in these discourses. And as I said, the 19th century was really where she, was injected into the mainstream. Also bearing in mind that within the 19th century, kind of alongside these like growing conceptualizations of queerness, within the institutions of, let's say, medicine, psychology, sexology, law, etc., the 19th century was also just one of very strict gender confines and misogynistic values. And so in a time where, in particular, women were expected to be sexless and self-sacrificial vessels, essentially, masculinist creatives of this era, besides being fascinated with like the occult and women of biblical lore, really used Lilith as this weaponized kind of femme fatale to express those 19th century anxieties about sexual women, autonomous women. Again, another component of the cultural backdrop to note is the budding first wave of feminism as well. So there's like a lot of tensions with sexuality and gender, and Lilith was primarily used in a weaponizing manner against, let's say the dangers of independent women or female sexuality. But Renee Vivien, I would say, sanctified and valorized Lilith. She's writing her poetry in the late 19th and early 20th century. She died quite young in 1909. Before getting into Vivien and Lilith, I do think that Vivien is such a fascinating historical figure. And I do want to note that she wasn't only using Lilith as a muse. Her biographer, Carla J., in Vivien's biography, The Amazon and the Page, says that Renee Vivien was on this poetic rescue mission to essentially unearth the forgotten, the misunderstood, or the vilified women of myth and history, and then retell their stories.
And Sappho was an extremely important.
Sappho is extremely important to Renee Vivien. Renee Vivien also translated several of Sappho's works from Greek to French. She was maybe even a bit obsessed with Sappho, which makes sense because Renee Vivien, even though as soon as she received her inheritance, when she was around, I want to say 21, she left England, moved to Paris, stopped speaking English, only spoke French, and, kind of existed in this bohemian fin de siècle, 19th century, very liberal city. However, she was like a very out and aggressively open lesbian. And even being in such a quote unquote liberal kind of 19th century city, this still put her in a self-expressed, as she would express herself, position of social ostracization and pariahship. And this is the kind of felt sense of ostracization, but also simultaneous pride. The ostracization from her sapphic sexuality, but also the immense pride and her, her personal belief, for instance, that lesbianism is the height of femininity, the highest and most holy expression of femininity. There was this tension within her. So it makes sense that in most of her poetic oeuvre, she turns evil women into heroines. She usually kind of revalorizes or reveres the misunderstood women of myth and history, also in a sapphic way or homoerotic way. She endeavors to debunk these kind of masculinist or patriarchal accounts of history and myth and presents villains such as Satan and Lilith as allies, not only to humans, but specifically marginalized humans, such as lesbians. But I think another really good example of, let's say, a monstrous female figure that Vivien subverts and sanctifies is the witch. But I also think that embedded within Vivien's poetic treatment of the witch, you can see bleeding through Vivien's expression of her own kind of like sexuality and the ostracization or persecution that causes, specifically in her poem Education, Enseignement. Pardon my pronunciation to any French listeners. She kind of writes this poem dedicated to witches. She is praising them for their dark occult knowledge, powers, abilities. But then in a certain line in this poem, she defends witches, saying they have a right to exist and be born. And I don't think, for instance, that is a far stretch to note that isolation and vilification, say, that would have been experienced by witches mythically or even historically via the witch hunts, etc., aligned with Vivien's kind of embodied experience as an out lesbian. Again, regardless of the fact that the 19th century Paris was more liberal. Just mentioning to kind of speak to Vivien's, mindset. There's also this poem called The Pillory, where Vivien writes herself in the place of Jesus on a cross. So kind of Vivien being crucified on the cross as this lesbian Jesus has this line that says, "For a long time, I was nailed on the cross, and women are pointing and laughing at me, and men are smearing mud on my face, and splashing it on my temples and my cheek." And this is, again, kind of Vivien's expression of her felt sense of being a social pariah. And she would kind of use Jesus for this in a few other places in her oeuvre, but unlike, Jesus, actual Jesus, and his famous empathy and love and compassion for humanity and, his mission of redemption, etc., Vivien had no kind of forgiveness or unconditional love for the masses. She hated men. She hated heterosexuality. She hated marriage. She hated childbirth. I would argue she wasn't part of like the feminist movement or political in that way. I think there are certain kind of poems that would even suggest that she did not like heterosexual women all that much. But kind of at the end of this poem, The Pillory, she says, "Silently I learned to hate them." So it was very much her and her sapphic comrades against the world, but she used mythic monsters or mythic figures of the vilified feminine to also align with this kind of not only outcast positionality, but also a lesbian positionality as well. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of poems in her oeuvre where she writes about everywhere I go, I don't belong here. And so you can see how, on the one hand, kind of a tortured poet she was, but also in her really kind of aggressive valorizations and reclamations of the monstrous feminine, you can also see how she used her poetry as this kind of counterattack against these like heterosexual, patriarchal, mainstream discourses within the 19th century, even besides Lilith.
Very fascinating figure. And much like somebody like Lord Byron, I think that she's engaging in ostension. I felt it was worth quoting this because it's just so metal. This is from her poem, Female Sovereigns.
Oh, yeah.
And it starts, "I populated the universe with shadows and demons. Before Eve, I was the light of the world, and I loved the perverse tempter, the serpent. I conceived the unreal in my deep soul. The earth bowed before my royalty. Jehovah made the fatal star of beauty bloom on my amorous brow. I was not happy." That is just amazing. I love that so much.
Yeah, I love that. I get goosebumps every time. Like that kind of reclamation or narrativistic subversion of Lilith. It is badass now, but especially badass for the 19th century. So it's super metal.
I think it's really interesting to contrast how Renee Vivien utilizes these female figures who are in their original context being used to create boundaries of what it means to be in that patriarchal society and breaking those boundaries to expressly present their alterity. I think it's really interesting to contrast the way she uses them with the way other earlier poets from the Romantic movement, like John Keats famously has, the Lamia poem, and of course, Samuel Taylor Coleridge with Christabel. Renee Vivien is not unique in this obsession with and utilization of tropes and myths from the ancient world. This is something that all of these writers and artists were using, but it's very interesting to see how she uses these figures as opposed to somebody like Keats or Coleridge. And just to get to the ostension, I love this tendency for people to express alterity in a world that has constraining categories, like especially when it uses like mythological figures like Lilith, or in the case of the 19th and 20th century, there's a reclamation of the classical past. Vivien uses Sappho, right? And then you have other mythological figures like Pandora, Andromeda, who in their original context are being used as categories to police the borders, right? And my favorite thesis actually is the fourth one, "The monster dwells at the gates of difference," because I think that people who want to rebel against the constraints of their time look for figures who are ciphers. I have this coinage that Lord Byron was kind of like the first rock star. Lord Byron was kind of like Trent Reznor before Trent Reznor. He was very conscious of what he was doing in terms of how he presented himself. I always like to say that every rock star in the 90s was trying to basically be Lord Byron. Because everybody's like, I'm so depressed and dark. And I'm like, well, if you read Lord Byron, you already know that's old hat. So I think that it's part of this self-mythologizing, right? And this gets back to the ostension. Ostension originally comes from Umberto Eco, right? So Umberto Eco just says that ostension is the way that people kind of show or present something as opposed to explaining it through words. So you show it through your actions. Life is art as performance, right? And of course, this is taken by folklorists into other directions in their work, right? And I think that what Renee Vivien and um, her embracing of somebody like Sappho and embracing somebody like Lilith is expressing alterity and a counterculture
Mhm.
tendency through, in essence, the transmission of a legend by performing rather than communicating it through words, although she did that as well. But, at her day to day life, of course, that's how she presented herself.
Yeah, she embodied this kind of Lilithian combatants of normativity and conformity and obedience even by being, an out and open, proud lesbian of the 19th century. Not only writing about it, but also embodying it, I think, certainly.
We were talking about monster theory, and I was looking at Renee Vivien and how, while her work doesn't explicitly engage with monster theory, I think that there are themes in her work that resonate with this framework that Cohen has set up. And I think we can find that in the theme of transgression, desire, societal rejection. If we're looking at the theses in and of themselves, I mean, of course, we had already mentioned thesis 4 about the monster dwells at the gates of difference. I mean, that's a perfect example of what Renee Vivien was doing there, but also about desire, about forbidden love, this obsession, passion, but maybe even destructive relationships that she talks about in her work. The third thesis about the monster is the harbinger of category crisis, blurring the boundaries between love and destruction, beauty and horror,
Mhm,
reinforcing the ideas that monsters are disrupting these established categories. So Lilith is that disruptor in
mhm.
this regard.
As is
And
Renee Vivien in the
yeah,
human, regard.
yeah. And
Yeah.
how it's all kind of linked together and repeating these patterns, I guess you could
Mhm,
say. Women that are both threatening and alluring at the same time. So, yeah, ambiguity to the nth degree, as we were talking about before, about this ambiguity. And then, of course, the cultural body,
yeah.
how she's talking about traditional gender roles and, transgressing against that. And as you had already explained what she was doing, the cultural anxieties that, were present in her day. She's reflecting that in her work as well. But I find it very interesting that there's really, I mean, although in our modern, contemporary, current day, I find a lot of these same themes are
Mhm,
repeating again and again and again. It doesn't really matter what era we're finding ourselves in. There's still these anxieties and still these boundaries that are being transgressed.
mhm.
And so I feel it's just as current today as it was in the time period that she was still alive and writing. So,
Absolutely.
yeah.
And, culture of society, humanity, we always have our monsters, but there's an interesting tension between who is afraid of the monster and weaponizes the monster or who aligns with or embraces the monster. I think that Lilith is a fantastic example of this. I think Renee Vivien really plays into this. And I wanted to get into the etymological root of monster as having these kind of two divergent paths. And we can apply this to the 19th century. So if we look at the representation of Lilith within the 19th century as produced by Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Victor Hugo, Remy de Gourmont, and all these male creators who were engaging with Lilith's myth in this weaponizing way, she's dangerous, terrifying, chaotic, unruly. This, on the one hand, harkens back to the likely etymological root of monster as the Latin monstrum, related to the verb monere, meaning to warn. So Lilith was kind of produced and presented in art and literature and occult discourses as a threat to 19th century or fin de siècle expectations about femininity, female sexuality, patriarchal control, etc. And also that would fall into Cohen's thesis of the monster as that border patrol agent maintaining like those structures of law and order and obedience and like socio-cultural expectations. But on the other hand, we're going to now go to the last thesis that Cohen had, the monster stands at the threshold of becoming. Cohen writes about monsters within this kind of theses as, I believe he calls them liberatory horizons and kind of representing utopic possibilities. And this would kind of evoke the other likely etymological root of monster as related to the verb monstrare, which means to show or reveal. And this is kind of like where my work on Lilith and specifically Renee Vivien kind of comes into play, is this showing or revealing or imparting something. Because if, we take and accept that mainstream view of the monster of this is a monster, this monster's bad, this is why you should be scared of this monster. If you align yourself with these certain traits, you will be a marginalized citizen, or maybe you already are a marginalized citizen. And the more you kind of align yourself with these monstrous traits as they can be embodied in human form, the more monstrous you become, the closer to the edge you get, and the monster's going to snatch you. But I think what Renee Vivien was doing was kind of saying, like, through aligning herself with the monster and all of, for instance, Lilith's taboo and negative traits, or traits that were deemed negative by the mainstream, was saying, okay, so what if I, Renee Vivien, do get to the edge? Is the monster actually going to snatch me? Or is the monster, Lilith, going to greet me like an old friend, impart gnosis on me, show me different, liberatory kind of potentials, different embodiments, subversive, transgressive power, discourses of resistance, etc. Like, is Lilith going to say, welcome back, happy you made it home? I think that this was Renee Vivien's, if I could be so bold to assume, how she may have been feeling. I think this was kind of Renee Vivien's poetic defiance of, if I do get to the edge of the monstrous, and society's already treating me like a perversion and treating Lilith like a perversion for the same kind of adjacent reasons. So I am actually already at the edge. So what if I throw myself over the edge? Will Lilith eviscerate me, or will she actually just be there to catch me? And I think that this is what Renee Vivien was doing, not only with Lilith, but all these other kind of vilified and misunderstood monstrous femme figures. She was, of course, also making a lot of these figures the monstrous queer, I would argue, including Lilith. That's my monster tangent in terms of Renee Vivien. She just really winds me up. She's so metal, and she was doing really subversive things poetically, I think, with monsters. So yeah.
I think it also ties into a question you asked us earlier about the utilization of Lilith as a cipher for possibility as opposed to limits. So I think that in an anachronistic sense, I think I would say that Renee was utilizing DC's 5 and 7. So Lilith is dwelling at the gates of difference. Like you said, if I fall off the chasm and I get to the edge, is that it, or is that the threshold of becoming? And I think that she took it in the direction of, can I create something and be something that I want? As Kripal would say, right, Stephanie, she's rewriting her story, her narrative. So
definitely taking that vilified other and creating something full of potential and wondrous possibility,
Yeah.
So.
Comrade Lilith. If, monsters, I would argue, are real because monsters are often indeed associated with different marginalized groups. And therefore, the monster has these material consequences of at least perpetuating stigma or taboo or fear, as also related to marginalized groups that said monster or demon or spirit is associated with by the mainstream culture. So then what happens if you're part of this marginalized group? You're kind of already on the edge of society. And what happens if you maybe embrace one of the monsters that the mainstream kind of culture already projects onto you or associates with you? It's like you're already kind of on the edge. So why not just fall over and see what happens? Stephanie, you said it much better just now.
I always remember what Kevin McLaughlin said at the end of an interview that I did with him and Sarah Perez. We were talking about different things, weird stuff, and I'm like, look, this is what I do. This is who I am. We're the weirdos. And he just laughed. He quoted that phrase from The Craft when the girls get off the bus and the bus driver says, watch out for the weirdos. And she's like, we are the weirdos, so we don't have to watch out. Yeah, that wondrous possibility of becoming something new and beautiful.
Yeah.
I wanted to discuss the BFF, so to speak, of Lilith and Renee Vivien's work, who is, of course, Satan, or Eblis, as she terms him. What role does Eblis play in his interactions with Lilith? How does she queer that, so to speak?
Also, part of Renee Vivien's worldview was that she did see this kind of battle between men and women where men were the aggressors or the antagonists. Therefore, she hated kind of these, let's say, masculinist or patriarchal institutions, one of which being Christianity/Catholicism. Positioned herself or her kind of female muses in a lot of her poems against God. Jesus was a Catholic figure that Renee Vivien used, as we were talking about the poem The Pillory, but not because of his connection to the Divine Father and not because of his forgiveness or unconditional love for humanity, but because of his suffering and this kind of asceticism, I think, that Renee Vivien identified with and was playing with. But Satan/Iblis as this adversary of Catholicism, Christianity, God, humanity in general within a Christian or Catholic discourse. Satan was a, let's say, like masculine figure that Vivien embraced by virtue of his antagonism towards like God and the patriarchy in that way. However, Vivien would somewhat, in my opinion, feminize Satan/Iblis. So I think a good example of that is in the poem Lilith, Hebrew Legend. This kind of retells the story of Lilith in the Garden of Eden and her leaving Adam and meeting Satan/Iblis. Interestingly, also in Vivien's poetic retelling of the Garden of Eden story, so kind of the Alphabet of Ben Sira narrative of the Garden of Eden story, Lilith doesn't flee or even leave Eden. After she kind of says goodbye to Adam and we're done, she's walking through the Garden of Eden at night, which again is kind of like a semiotically poetic nuance that's important to note. Day, daytime, sun, masculine, night, nighttime, moon, lunar, feminine. So Lilith is walking through the Garden of Eden at night and she sees Satan, who is actually in the form of a snake. And essentially, this is, I would say, one of the ways that Vivien queers Satan, because in this poem, Lilith and Satan do have sex, or at least talk about having sex. But because Vivien was writing it and she was also always trying to sanctify lesbianism or queerness and wasn't a fan of heterosexuality, she couldn't make it heterosexual sex, of course. So first, Lilith stumbles upon Satan/Iblis in the form of a snake. So, okay, he's not in the form of a human man. And as they're discussing amongst themselves, as they meet, I think Lilith is saying to Satan, "You tempt me with the vulgar bait of pleasure. Be my mystical lover." But then right after that, Lilith says, "I will not conceive and I will not give birth under or from your embrace, but our dreams will populate the earth and our chimeras or like demon children will incarnate the future." This is essentially also, I would argue, queering Satan, or at least queering the sex between Lilith and Satan in this poem, because he's not in a male-sexed human body. The sterility of Lilith or Satan is emphasized, so there'll be no childbirth, no reproduction. However, their copulation will be so perverse and kind of spit in the face of love, like heterosexual love, what she would have had with Adam, and their kind of, perversion of love will incarnate into the future. Also, either in this poem or in another poem where snakes are written about as Lilith's servants. So it's also kind of putting Satan/Iblis as a snake in this poem in a more submissive positionality to Lilith. So this is how I would say that Vivien queered Satan, but again, not necessarily queering Satan in such a simplistic way. When I say queered Satan, I mean she constructed a poetic sexual interaction between Lilith and Satan that did not conform to or lie within the boundaries of heterosexuality, in several ways broke expectations or realities of heterosexuality, such as no reproduction, female human body, and a snake, a demonic snake, kind of then removing this engendering of Satan as male. And of course, the submissive positionality of Satan to Lilith, which is juicy and great. But fun to mention that it wasn't just Satan that Vivien wrote about. There is this one poem entitled 13, in which she writes of 4 high-ranking demons essentially crashing a wedding in order to save the bride from a future of heterosexual oppression and eventual child rearing. And the demons are Moloch, Belial, Beelzebub, and Astaroth. So she uses other kind of male, demons in her oeuvre, but if they're satanic or demonic, they're not masculinized, really, in her usage, it seems.
Did she perhaps consider them genderless?
That's a really good question. I'm not sure if she considered them genderless. She could play with kind of their embodiments. I think the most important perspective that she had was they were enemies of her enemy. Like, she's writing poems about Lilith as the fatal star of beauty. The female demon Lilith, she has her other poem, The Litany of Hate, where it's like this lesbian manifesto where she says the dark breath of Lilith is within us. She refers to Lilith as like fever, desire, perversity in The Veil of Vashti. So she is very much embracing and aligning with and sanctifying and valorizing Lilith, but she'll use like male demons because they're the enemy of her enemy. So she'll align with them. But that is a good question. I wonder, if she thought they were genderless.
Maybe both. Maybe like an androgen.
Maybe, yeah. Or maybe both.
Yeah.
And that also ties into the monster as well. Androgens are always like that monstrum, as the birth of a hermaphrodite or something in Antiquity was always considered
exactly
an ominous portent. Yeah, just
boundaries.
Crisis category, right? I found very fascinating Renee Vivien's embracing of basically a medieval women's mystic way of looking at Jesus, emphasizing the suffering. Yeah. I really love that, because anything you read in the medieval women's visionary literature, there's always an emphasis on the suffering of Christ. And again, this embracing of the passive in Jesus as opposed to the powerful Pantocrator kind of image you see of him as triumphing over death. They emphasize the suffering and the humiliation of Jesus. Meditation on the suffering of Christ. And as you mentioned in the biography of Renee, she converted to Catholicism. It was also very ambiguous about why she did it.
Yes, she converted to Catholicism on her deathbed. It was because of a woman. So it might have been her piano teacher or childhood friend. I can't quite remember, that she was in love with was a Catholic. And so then she, converted a few days before she passed away. But also, I think Renee Vivien, like you said, and I love the connection you made, Jason, between like Renee Vivien's treatment of Jesus and a medieval mystical nun. Vivien just loves the suffering and these darker sides of Christianity that, to her, I think Jesus embodied. So that could have played into it. But I would resist the narrative that maybe she spent her life as a satanic, championing, lesbian, pagan poet and maybe got scared on her deathbed. I don't think that's the case.
I would almost look at it like, just from what I've gathered about her personality, I think she would look at it as almost like a black comedy or a dark joke, like very ironic. But also she seemed very sincere. And it's very interesting when you look at these medieval women mystics and their embracing of Jesus' suffering. Many times they're also trying to break the boundaries of the possible and find their own way in their world. So even though we have these texts that are mediated many times through a male writing it down, usually a monk or something like that, it's very interesting how their voice breaks through and resists the attempts to put them in a box. And I think that they use that suffering of Jesus, and again, emphasizing the passive as instead of the triumphant and the usual concepts of Jesus as this all-powerful God. It's like he's a suffering, humiliated figure.
For someone who studies demons and monsters, I have a tattoo of St. Catherine of Siena. And the way she kind of also treated Jesus, like her parents tried to marry her off and she said, "Oh, I actually can't. I'm already engaged to Jesus. He gave me his foreskin as a, engagement ring." She became this kooky nut. And like the way she speaks about Jesus is his pain, but pain bringing you to the edge of like God's piercing love. And like, very metal. My fascination with the weird saints as well. Yeah.
It's like oftentimes you read about the ecstasy these mystics are feeling as well in this intense pain.
Mm.
And that is also quite transgressive and deviant in a way. So, very.
Yeah, Justin Sledge and I had a conversation about this topic. He likened a lot of their divine erotic writings to almost like a proto-BDSM.
Oh,
yeah, I wasn't going to mention it. Okay, you did.
Yeah. I love that read.
But Brennan, you'll be teaching a course on Lilith soon for Morbid Anatomy. So what can we expect?
That course, the Morbid Anatomy course, is going to cover in much more detail a lot of what we discussed today. So it's 8 weeks, 2-hour sessions, and they are recorded, of course, for people who can't, make it. Yeah, it's East Coast US based time. However, I love when students can make it because usually the Zoom class discussion chat feature is popping off. I have kind of organized the course on Lilith in 3 sections. So first part is her origin and historical conceptions, where we talk about Lilith in antiquity and ancient times and also cover the Alphabet of Ben Sira, Greco-Roman discourses, pretty much most of the things we covered today in more detail, and also certain topics from antiquity or the Middle Ages that we didn't get to. I love going a bit more into Lilith and exorcism rituals because I find exorcisms fascinating. And then the second part is Lilith's reception history from the 19th to the 21st centuries. So obviously the 19th century is kind of I don't know if I'd say specialty or just the current world in which I live in, because that is all I read and write about at this moment. However, we also discuss Lilith's role within the 20th and 21st centuries in terms of esoteric and occult discourses and milieus and rituals and orders, Lilith within kind of psychoanalysis, feminist reclamations of Lilith, to also discussing Lilith in the 21st century, which is really fun for me because that means we also get to discuss Lilith on Witch Talk, the kind of witchy subspace of TikTok, but also we get to discuss Lilith within current kind of new age conspiracist theory or political demonology discourses within mostly an American context. And then the third part is 2 special topic sessions where we discuss Lilith and monster theory. So we go really into monster theory in a little bit more detail than we did here. And then the second special topics class is Lilith and queerness, where of course we talk about Renee Vivien. We talk about the Colombian neo-Gnostic guru / sex magical practitioner Samuel Unware of the 20th century and how he actually weaponized Lilith and used her as a fear-inducing border patrol agent for his very heteronormative and misogynistic system of sex magic. There's a lot to cover there. And then actually the last class, the 8th class, my fave, is I take all of the student questions that come up in the 7 weeks prior, do a little presentation answering all of those or going on any kind of rocks left unturned in terms of Lilith. And then it gets turned over to students to give a presentation on, Lilith of their choice, whether it's a poem they wrote, a PowerPoint they did. One student, the last time I ran this course, applied different Lilithian narratives to each of Cohen's 7 theses. One student just dressed up as Lilith, and it was impressive. So it can be creative, academic, anything, but it's 8 weeks of collaboration and learning about monsters, demons, queerness, history. That's what you can expect.
Sounds like a grand time.
Yeah, it's fun. It's fun for me. That's
all that matters, right? It's like the show. It's like the show is fun for me.
Yes.
No, that's wonderful.
It's always fun to talk to Brennan, and it's always fun to talk with Jason as well. And I just wanted to say thank you again for inviting me. Somebody said that to me before about, this is a topic that you know everything about because you've talked to me about this beforehand. Not you, Brennan, but another person, Like, oh, yeah, you already know. I've already told you everything about it. I'm like, no, I always learn something new every time I talk to whoever it is,
Yeah.
Even though we have talked many, many times about this, I'm always learning something new. That's the great thing about having conversations like this is that it is always this fertile ground for new things that come up, new things that, I haven't thought about that before. Let me write that down. Let me look into that. This is new. These are new areas to explore. I think that's great.
Stephanie, also just great to talk to you as always in person or on Rejected Religion. But Jason, I'm so happy to have finally met you.
So this has been a fantastic discussion. Thank you so much, Brennan. Thank you, Stephanie, again, for always keeping the ship on course whenever I go off on a tangent. Until next time, y'all take care. Y'all have a fabulous week.
Thank you, Jason.
So much. Thank you both.